Αγαπητοί φίλοι και φίλες του Ελεύθερου Πανεπιστημίου για την Ομογένεια του Λονδίνου, άρχισα πριν λίγα λεπτά να χαμογελώ. Όσοι με θυμούνται να στέκομαι εδώ, δεν στεκόμουν πάντοτε με το ίδιο ύφος. Χαίρομαι ιδιαίτερα γιατί έχουμε αρκετή νεολαία απόψε μαζί μας και ελπίζω και αναμένω ότι θα τους έχουμε και σε επόμενες διαλέξεις. Όπως είπαμε, στο πρόγραμμα του Πανεπιστημίου της Κύπρου θα έχουμε διαλέξεις στα αγγλικά, ειδικά για την νεολαία μας. Γιατί θέλουμε την νεολαία να έρθει πιο κοντά μας και ιδιαίτερα να στρατολογηθεί στον αγώνα για τη διατήρηση της ταυτότητας της παροικίας μας και για τη συνέχιση του σκληρού αγώνα που διεξάγει ο κυπριακός λαός και η παροικία μας για την ελευθερία της Κύπρου από τα τουρκικά στρατεύματα κατοχής. Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ ιδιαίτερα την νεολαία και βέβαια τους τακτικούς φοιτητές του Ελεύθερου Πανεπιστημίου για την Ομογένεια του Λονδίνου. Ο ομιλητής μας απόψε είναι ένας νέος της δεύτερης γενεάς της παροικίας μας, ο οποίος γεννήθηκε και μεγάλωσε εδώ, φοιτήσε στα ελληνικά μας σχολεία, τελείωσε το Πανεπιστήμιο και τώρα σε λίγο χρόνο θα δώσει τις εξετάσεις του για PhD στη ρωσική φιλολογία στο Πανεπιστήμιο της Οξφόρδης. Αλλά όμως η αγάπη του για τα ελληνικά, και θέλω να πιστεύω ότι προήλθε από τους δασκάλους του στο ελληνικό σχολείο, τον έκανε να ασχοληθεί και με έναν από τους μεγαλύτερους ποιητές της Ελλάδας, τον Κωνσταντίνο Καβάφη. Δεν διάβασε Καβάφη, μπορώ να πω ότι εμελέτησε τον Καβάφη και έλαβε μέρος σε σεμινάρια στην Ελλάδα και αλλού και μίλησε ο ίδιος για τον Καβάφη. Εκτός από αυτά, ο νεαρός Παναγιώτης έχει και το κυπριακό φιλότιμο. Όταν επισκέπτεται τη Ρωσία σαν μελετητής της ρωσικής γλώσσας, δημιούργησε εκεί ομάδες ο ίδιος νέων και φοιτητών των πανεπιστημίων, ακόμη και λεκτόρων, και συζητούν για την ρωσική γλώσσα. Ακόμη δημιούργησε ομάδες για να διδάσκουν φτωχά και παιδιά που δεν έχουν τους πόρους να φοιτήσουν στα σχολεία, και ακόμη δημιούργησε μία φιλανθρωπική οργάνωση για να βοηθά παιδιά να σπουδάζουν. Αυτά στη μακρινή Ρωσία από έναν νεαρό Κύπριο του Λονδίνου. Το συγχαίρουμε τον Παναγιώτη και του ευχόμαστε σε ακόμα μεγαλύτερες επιτυχίες. Και τον καλούμε να μας μιλήσει απόψε για τον Καβάφη. Παναγιώτη.
Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ στον κύριο Αντρέα για αυτά τα θερμά τα λόγια. Στο Brotherhood στο Federation και στην ΕΠΟΜΑΚ, ειδικά τον κύριο Χριστόν Καραολή, για την πρόσκληση να μιλήσω μαζί σας σήμερα για τον Καβάφη. Θα μιλήσω στα αγγλικά, αλλά βέβαια στο τέλος, αν θέλετε, έχετε κάποιες ερωτήσεις στα ελληνικά, δεν είναι θέμα. Και ελπίζω να είναι μια ενδιαφέρουσα συζήτηση μαζί σας. Okay, so the main question that I'm asking myself tonight and kind of trying to pose to you is why is CAVAFY readable and rereadable? I wanted to start off with some not very academic research. So the first is a story and the second is a picture. Firstly, the story. In preparation for this talk, I asked some friends in Greece, Cyprus, and elsewhere which modern Greek writers they knew. There were two answers, pretty much only two answers. One of them was CAVAFY and the other one was no one. So we have a choice between CAVAFY and no one. The second situation is a bit kind of stranger. And I wanted to kind of show you again, this seems a bit bizarre, but I will show you why I think this is interesting. It's a picture of some cinnamon rolls, which was posted on Instagram about 6 months ago. Now, obviously, it looks a bit bizarre. Why am I talking to you about cinnamon rolls in a speech about a 20th century poet? On the right-hand side, it's been tagged Stiskalis, hashtag CAVAFY. And then the writer, well, the person who's posted it has posted a poem, which is kind of a bizarre poem, to accompany this photo. But it's posted it on Instagram. So really, these are the kind of questions that I've been asking. How do we get to the position where wherever you ask, whoever you ask, you get the same answer? Which Greek writers do you know? And they say CAVAFY. And secondly, how do we get to the stage where we have pictures of cinnamon rolls and kind of Instagram posts which are based or kind of surrounding the poet? So in this talk, I'm going to be concentrating not on the popularity of CAVAFY and his reception, but on the reasons, as I said, why we can read his texts and have continued to reread them many times over, both in Greece, Cyprus, in the Greek-speaking world, and abroad. I'm interested not just in the rereading of CAVAFY, but also in the rereading of CAVAFY's text, but also in the rereading of CAVAFY. He's a poet who has, for many reasons, been of interest for his biography. People are interested in his personal documents, his photographs, and these have been read with as much interest as his poetry. So there have been hundreds of critical articles on the different interpretations of CAVAFY's life and works, but very little analysis on why these interpretations have come up in the first place. So that's kind of the main issue that I'm trying to kind of tackle today. The argument that I would like to develop is one based on gaps. So I'm using the word gaps here, both literally and metaphorically, to show how various empty spaces and omissions are inherent in innumerable aspects of the poet's life and works. So in these gaps, the reader is able, and invited indeed, to read that which he wishes, and to imaginatively create personal views of how these spaces should be filled up. In their variations, ranging from all ends of the social, political, sexual, and cultural spectrums, these interpretations in turn engender further debates, as there are often huge differences between the individual interpretations. An ex-professor at Oxford, Peter Mackridge, Emeritus of Greek, has noted that CAVAFY's poetic text can be read in many different ways due to the in-betweenness of his poetic voice. And here's a quote from Mackridge. In his poetry, he, CAVAFY, often adopts a betwixt and between position. In other words, he chooses a position which is in the middle. Many of his characters are betwixt and between in their ethnic, religious, and sexual identities, while he himself was betwixt and between in his use of language, meter, and rhyme. What I wish to emphasize, however, is that these various instances of in-betweenness extend to the study of CAVAFY as a whole. And these are created by gaps, empty spaces, in the poet's biography and text. So that's kind of what I want to look at today. The discussion is going to be into two parts, going to be split into two parts. In the first, I will expand on the idea of gaps to explain how some of the various readings that have taken place over the last 100 years and beyond can be explained through this idea of gaps. And I will talk a little bit about his biography and give a broad overview of some critical positions. In the second part, I would like to talk about how these gaps are also on the level of the text, so the poetic text, and I've given you 3 texts to look at. Just a very small kind of caveat here. I don't have time to allude to all the critical debates surrounding the poet, and any omissions that I make are not to be read as criticisms of the works of others, but simply they've just been chosen They just haven't been discussed, or I won't discuss them due to issues related to time. So let's begin with his biography. On paper, his life was pretty uneventful and kind of boring when you reread it for different reasons. Konstantinos Pedro Kaváfi was born on the 29th of April 1863, and he died on his birthday 70 years later, so he was exactly 70 years old when he died. He was the last of 9 children to be born into a well-off Greek merchant family in the city of Alexandria in Egypt, a city where he would live for the majority of his life and the city where he would die. His father, Bedros, passed away when he was aged, when Kaváfi was aged, Konstantinos was aged 7, and the family trading business which his father ran collapsed soon after his death. Kaváfi spent many years in the 1870s and 80s living in England. He lived in London and also in, slightly bizarrely now, Liverpool. At the time, it was a very kind of important merchant port. And also in Constantinople. The poet held a clerical job in the irrigation office of the Egyptian government for 30 years. Again, kind of a bizarre kind of detail in the life of a poet. He only visited Greece a few times for tourist reasons and made a final visit there a year before his death in 1932. This was in an attempt to cure his throat cancer. He died of, this is the illness from which he would die subsequently. So in this kind of brief overview of his biography, I also wanted to, if we return to our discussion of gaps, emphasize that there's much that we do not know and we will never know about the poet. This is evidenced in the fullest English biography that we have, which is Kaváfi, a critical biography by Robert Liddell from 1974. When we read this text, we realize that any biographer is confronted with gaps and black spots in the poet's life. There are times and events about which we have no information. Many of these gaps will be filled in by a new biography that's coming out, probably 2020, 2021, by the American academics Gregory Justainus and Peter Jeffries. Even though this book, the new biography, will benefit from the opening of Kaváfi's archive, the archive is a separate issue which I'll discuss in a bit, there are still many issues related to his life that are not documented. So when he was in England and Constantinople, for example, we don't know very much about what he did there and what he was up to. We also know very little about his lovers, or potential lovers. He begins to write poetry in the 1880s, and he wrote up until the very end of his life. He was fluent in English and had an excellent command of French, though he wrote all his poetry, well, nearly all his poetry, in Greek. This Greek has been noted by critics over the years for its combination of both katharevousa and demotiki forms of the Greek language. During his life, he never published his collected works, but he did publish and distribute numerous collections of poems. His preferred way of publishing was predominantly by selecting certain poems and sending them either individually or collectively to individuals. So what he would do was he would write poetry, finish his poems, and keep them in different parts of his house. And then when he would send it to Mr. X, for example, he would choose 1 or 2 poems from each collection, put them together, pin them together, and then send them off. So it's kind of like a customized way of presenting your work. So in this way, he created these kind of unique collections, and each edition and print run was slightly different from the other. So we have an issue here already with this idea of canonical text and what the canonical text actually is, because there are slight variations in editions and texts themselves. Over time, he used to, for example, slightly revise and change certain aspects of his text as well. Much work has been carried out in the UK and in Greece and abroad on the intricacies of his publishing process. Two academics are probably Anthony Hurst and Sarah Ekdawi, that I would kind of underline here. And more recently, there's an academic called William Strobel who's provided some clarity on his printing processes. Here's a quick quote from Strobel here. His control, so Kaváfi's control of the poem's textual production, is practically unrivaled in the 20th century. During his lifetime, he was the writer, editor, designer, binder, publisher, distributor, and at times censor of his own poems. So we have this kind of jack of all trades who is the poet himself as well. The first collected edition of his works was published in 1935 by Rika Singopoulos. And it was made up of 153 poems that Kavāfy published in his lifetime in various forms, as well as the final poem which he finalized for printing, which is called On the Outskirts of Antiochia, Στα περίχωρα της Αντιοχίας, from 1933. These poems were published in chronological order by Sengopoulou, something that Kavāfy, as we've mentioned, never really did himself. Due to his methods of publishing, the printing of such an edition was always to be bound up with certain problems and issues related to the poet's individual papers and his archive. So I just wanted to give you kind of a few words about the archive. Rika Sengopoulou was the wife of Elekos Sengopoulos, who was the literary heir of Kavāfy's papers and works. George Savvidis, in many ways the most important Kavāfy scholar of the 20th century, was shown this archive in 1961 and became its owner 8 years later. He would work on it until his death in 1995. The archive then went on to George Savvidis' son Manolis, who subsequently sold it in 2012 to the Onassis Foundation in Athens. During his years of scholarship, George would publish a new edition of the 154 poems, as well as publish and help publish various editions of Kavāfy's repudiated poems, unpublished poems, and unfinished poems. Kavāfy was therefore uncovered and discovered many times over during the 20th century. And this process was kind of intimately tied up with the poet's personal papers. So where does the issue of gaps fit in here? Well, there have been gaps in between the publication of these different documents from the Kavāfy archive, which have resulted in these kind of reassessments of the poet over time as these new documents have come to life and have been published. I just wanted to kind of briefly mention a couple of debates relating to the poet in academic circles before we move on to looking at the poems themselves. There have been, over the 20th century, over the course of the 20th century, there have been several interpretations initiated by some of the most important Greek literary critics and writers relating to Kavāfy. So just some names that you might have heard of. Dimos Malanos looked at Kavāfy through the lens of kind of Freudian psychoanalysis. Stradis Tsirkas saw him as this kind of pseudo-Marxist revolutionary. Seferis depicts him as, with again some caveats, as a kind of national poet, a poet of Greece. So as you can see, there are kind of different. I mean, how can you be a nationalist and a Marxist at the same time? There are kind of confusions here. So what happens is that each of these writers takes the poet and his works and makes them their own. They're analysing the same materials, but they're coming to different conclusions. In a more academic setting, I would say that Kavāfy has led to wider discussions, or through Kavāfy we've had wider discussions on Greek criticism, its role in the world, and themes and issues internally within Greek literary criticism, and Greek philology on a university level, both in Greece and abroad. Just wanted to quickly give you one example. In 1983, there was a discussion in a journal called the Journal of the Hellenic Diaspora. And this was between a US-based academic, Vasilis Lambropoulos, and a UK-based academic, Roderick Beaton. Lambropoulos, in a reading of one of Kavāfy's poems, he comes to a kind of a strange conclusion, which, again, don't worry if it's a bit dense. It makes sense when you think about it. So what Lambropoulos says is that my interpretation of this poem is a hermeneutical interpretation, a political interpretation of interpretations, and interpretive resistance against the domineering interpretations and interpolation of interpenetrations and interrogation of interrelations and interspersion of interpersonal intersections. I will get to the kind of the more general public's view of Kavāfy in a bit as well. Beaton would criticise this view. It's kind of a very post-structuralist view. It's an incredible article. If you're interested in it, it's really worth getting hold of that. And also Beaton's response, which is really interesting. So Beaton would then say that Lambropoulos' approach was wrong for different reasons. So that we end up having this debate of what Greek literary criticism should be, where it should stand, how it should function, all through Kavāfy and the Kavāfyan texts. So he's stimulating new conversations, and the critical positions that are taken up, so Lambropoulos versus Beaton, for example, they have huge gaps, going back to the topic that I was discussing before, in between them, gaps that are quite difficult to bridge. Just two more very quick discussions, more recent discussions about Kavāfy, and then, like I said, we're going to get to the kind of the textual analysis itself. Two discussions that I think should be underlined. One is regarding the social circumstances in which he wrote. So what was Alexandria like when Kavafi was writing? What was his position in that city and in that country of Egypt? A discussion's been taking place recently through Hala Khalim's book from 2013 called Alexandrian Cosmopolitanism and Archive. And she's been discussing these kind of issues and seeing Kavafi as both an Egyptian and a Greek. So we kind of, especially in Greece and Cyprus, think of Kavafi as a Greek writer, which of course for many, and in many ways he is. But I think sometimes we forget that he lived all his life in a non-Greek country, if that makes, if we can say that. Even though Alexandria did have quite a few cosmopolitan aspects, it wasn't mainland Greece. So Khalim takes this kind of argument against kind of making, she counters a Eurocentric argument on Kavafi, basically. It's a worthy book. Another debate that's been spotlighted has surrounded the poet's sexuality. In debates begun in many ways in the 80s by Margaret Alexiou and Peter Bean, among others, again, academic circles, recent scholars have sought to use queer theory and contemporary theories of sexuality to reassess the homosexual themes, traits, and positions in Kavafi's poems. Dimitris Papanikolaou at Oxford has done a lot of work on these issues, and he's provoked much positive conversation on this. Again, these are, of course, not the only debates surrounding the poet that are currently ongoing, and merely point to the fact that there are many avenues in his life that are still waiting to be understood, probed, delved into. In many ways, however, as I've been trying to hint, the issue at hand is not why literary critics and academics read Kavafi, read and reread him, developing new assessments over time, but how and why does the non-critic, does the non-academic read and reread Kavafi's life and his texts? His appeal in the Greek and non-Greek-speaking world is pretty astonishing. He's been translated in many languages several times over, so I think in English there are, I think, at least 15 different translations of his canonical texts. He's been alluded to and discussed by some of the most well-known writers of the 20th century. He's had films made about him and about his life, about his poetry. And on the 150-year anniversary of the poet's birth in 2013, there was in many ways a crystallization of this kind of canonization as the Greek writer, as the Greek poet, both nationally and internationally. And people have been discovering and thinking recently more about how his works and his literary myth appear in our daily lives. So I just wanted to kind of take a small kind of detour here and just show you some examples of how he appeals to the wider public, to give some evidence of his kind of relevance or prevalence in today's world. I just wanted to give a few, so I started a little bit at the start with Instagram, but now I wanted to kind of go into the other direction and look at Twitter. So what I've done is I've just kind of pulled together a few kind of examples of what I mean. So I ran a search in Twitter with the word Kavafi in Greek. And here are just three of the examples. So the first person says, some call it poetry, I name it psychotherapy, with a love heart emoji, hashtag Kavafi, hashtag life coaching. Okay, so someone's obviously finding some sort of inspiration in his works for how to lead their lives. The second one is kind of a strange one, and I worry for the person that wrote it. I think they're a bit down. Mono Kavafis, τίποτα άλλο ελληνικό, δεν αντέχω να διαβάσω. Miseriazo, with this kind of strange emoji face, not quite happy or not quite sad. So only Kavafi, I can't stand reading any other Greek, I'm in a miserable state. The third one was above, and these are all recent posts, these have all been posted about 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, over the last 2 to 3 weeks. The last one was by, it was a couple, there was a picture of a couple, and the woman was wearing a bikini and the guy was in his swimming trunks and they were swimming together and holding each other and kissing. And then there was this above that photo. So they posted it on their own profile, on their own Twitter. Μόνο η αγάπη μας έμεινε. Πολέμα, μη μας την πάρουν κι αυτοί. Kavafis. Again, I'm not, that quotation I don't even think is from Kavafis. I'm a bit confused. Kalimera yolus. So only love has remained. Fight so they don't take this away from us too. A good day to all. So then I ran a separate search as well of Kavafi in English. And there were some strange things that came up as well. So the first one was this lady who gave a picture, this kind of caricatured picture of Kavafi, and then she said, dedicating my hashtag sweet, hashtag creative, hashtag Sunday, hashtag evening to hashtag Kavafi, setting some of his hashtag sublime, hashtag poems to hashtag music with a little keyboard. Again, the hashtags aside, it's a different interpretation to the other three that we've seen so far. They've all been quite different. The last one is kind of strange. This was written just before the election, so the recent election in England. So unless you vote Johnson out, there was this kind of, this gentleman writing this, you will be reciting CAVAFY on December 13th. The barbarians are due here today. Why isn't anything going on in the Senate? Why are the senators sitting there not legislating? Because the barbarians are coming. So I'm not quite sure, again, this one confused me because I wasn't sure who the barbarians are meant to be. So Johnson's come into power, but who are the barbarians now? It's a slight confusion. There's a slight confusion here in the post. But again, it's not about the kind of, we're not talking about British politics here. We're not trying to figure out who barbarians are and whether the Labour Party or any other political party is a barbaric party. It's not the issue. The issue is more how and why do people feel that it's relevant or find it useful to pick out these kind of instances. They all highlight in different ways that Kavafy is an interlocutor, so he's someone you can converse with on themes of love, politics, and emotional well-being, if we looked at those posts. There are mentions of dialogues with him from specific lines, dialogues with specific poems, dialogues with the man's works. It's kind of a real kind of multifaceted approach to him that we see online. These posts and the other debates that we've looked at already can be partially attributed, I would suggest, to the gaps in his biography, to the way that the poems are published, edited, and the spaces and the ways that the poet has been analysed over the time, the spaces in between these critical positions. But they only go so far in explaining these kind of 5 instances. What I would like to now kind of go into in the second part is the way that we can reread, is the fact that we can read and reread Kavafy due to the gaps, indeterminacies, and blind spots in his actual texts. So it's because of the text that we have these different interpretations from depression to modern British politics. So the 3 poems to be analysed are the ones that you have on your sheets. In order to develop my final points regarding the multiple possible readings of Kavafy's text and the gaps in the text, I'd like to look at 2 poems from the 1920s and 1 from the 1930s. The year 31 BC in Alexandria was written in 1924, In the Same Space, 1929, and The Mirror in the Entrance, 1930s. All 3 of these texts fall into the canon of published texts, and each of them seems to be built upon a historical, philosophical, or sensual premise, respectively. As I will argue, however, these categories are restrictive, as each poem transcends these groupings. It goes beyond them. Just a quick note about the editions. The Greek edition is from the 2007 Anthony Hurst Oxford publication, and the English ones are from Daniel Mendelssohn's 2013 edition of the English translations of the text. As I kind of hope to show you, the Kavafyan text may be read, understood, and interpreted without this general kind of recourse to historical contextual details. And it's this ability of the text, alongside the gaps that I will hopefully show, that has helped his rereadability over time. So I just wanted to kind of I'll read the text in English. You have the Greek texts there. So the year 31 BC in Alexandria. From his little village near the city's outskirts, still dusted with his journey's dirt, the peddler arrives. He hawks his wares, incense, gum, the finest oil, scent for your hair, through the streets. But the tremendous stir in the music and parades won't let him be heard. The mob shoves him, drags him, knocks him down. And at the height of his confusion, when he asks, what on earth is going on? Someone tosses him the palace's gargantuan lie. That victory in Greece belongs to Antony. So I just want to very quickly discuss this poem, and then I'll get into the specifics. 31 BC is the Battle of Actium, where Mark Antony goes to fight Octavian, who would then subsequently be renamed Augustus, and Mark Antony loses. So what's happened is that Cleopatra, this is based in Alexandria, Cleopatra, who's Mark Antony's lover, spreads, even though she knows that Antony has lost, she spreads the lie that he's won in order to keep the citizens kind of happy. And on the backdrop of all of this, we have this peddler, this tradesman, who arrives in the city from the outside, from a little village, and he tries to kind of sell his things, sell his kind of wares, unaware that, in fact, he's not going to sell anything because there's madness on the streets, positive kind of revelry. So just quickly with the title. So our expectations of time and place are set up immediately in the title. We have a specific year, we have a specific city. However, instead of this kind of grand event that we expect to find, we're introduced to this kind of small, lowly tradesman who's come from a small town into the city. So there's a gap between the expectation of what the poem will be about and what the poem is actually about. We assume that the city is Alexandria, but notably in the poem there's no mention of Alexandria at all. So the title is necessary to actually understand which city the poet is talking about. The salesman has a lot of noise that he comes up against and joyful chaos. And when he asks someone what's happening, he's obviously been told that Antony is winning. So that kind of explains why he's confused and why he can't sell anything. The narrative perspective is just something quickly to underline here. It's told through a double perspective. So we see the scene through the narrator's eyes, so from his little village, but we also see it from the actual perspective of the tradesman. So what on earth is going on? That's the eyes of the narrator before and the eyes of the tradesman there. So we have this kind of double vision, as it were. And the narrator kind of zooms into the tradesman's past, and he also zooms into bits of speech, the scene, the city. So the narrator is this kind of godlike figure in a way. In terms of themes, the poem seems to be historical. But there are also other kind of binary oppositions and issues at hand here. So there's the issue of commerce and merchants. This is a poem about selling things, taking something to sell somewhere else, making money. It's about the little man versus the crowd. We have a big mass of people, and we have this small individual. It's also a poem about the city versus the rural. So what I wanted to kind of underline here was that it can also be read as quite an ahistorical poem. So even though we're told that this is based on a historical event, and there is a historical event, the Battle of Actium actually did take place, there's a strangeness at the end, and it comes in the last line. In the Greek it says Elava, so στην Ελλάδα ο Αντώνιος νικά. Well, of course, the strangeness is here that there was no idea of Elava in 31 BC. The nation-state only occurs and comes to being in the 19th century. So what's happening here? Why is there this confusion? Well, it's kind of, I would suggest that this last words, the word Greece in the last line is important because he's conflating two events. Kavafy is saying to us, in a way, that ancient Alexandria could possibly be allegories, symbols of what's happening in present-day Alexandria and present-day Greece. So he creates this confusion knowingly by saying Greece, when in fact it couldn't have been the case. So he creates this kind of mishmash of and confusion in time. Vocabulary, quite a typical Kavafian trait. It's quite prosaic and quite simplistic. We find out that the trader comes from a mikri komi, a little village. We see a tremendous, in the Greek it says blithos, so we see a crowd, there's a palace, but we don't have any description of these things, they're just named. So little village is what? I mean, what does it look like? A palace, how big is it? What is it? What are the colours that it has? In fact, there are no colours in this poem. We try to imagine a poem which we don't actually know what's happening. There are no colours, like I said. It's a very plain scene. The only colours are probably the finest oils, which potentially could be olive oil, so we get the green, and the dust, which has this kind of brown, grey colour to the scene. So these are all the details I would suggest, these kind of colourless details, and these words, the baladi and the blithos, that we, as readers, have to kind of use to build up a scene. We're not given the scene. So our imagination is involved in this text already, and we have to jump in and fill in the gaps, as it were, in the poem. So the poem is made up of various gaps in knowledge, given and unresolved, historical and geographical confusions, which destabilize the notion of the poem about a specific historical moment. The next poem's a little bit shorter, Στον ίδιο χώρο, written in 1929. And in this poem, I would suggest that what happens is that we get more questions asked than are asked than answered. So there's less resolution than kind of it seems. So again, I'll just quickly read it in English. In the same space, house, coffee houses, neighbourhood, setting that I see and where I walk, year after year, I crafted you amid joy and amid sorrows, out of so much that happened, out of so many things, and you've been wholly remade into feeling for me. As with the previous poem, the title's problematic. We're given a space, a χώρο, στον ίδιο χώρο, but we don't know what position this space has in time or place. So there's a confusion. Even though we're told where we are, we don't actually know where we are. The poem begins with a set of 3 genitive nouns, in the Greek anyway, οικίας, περιβάλλον, κέντρον, συνοικίας, so οικίας, κέντρον, συνοικίας, that designate locale, and we sense after the end of line 2 that these are spaces, that these spaces are real, and given to us by the unnamed speaker, because he says that he can see them, he can walk through them. Another problematic word here in the Greek is περιβάλλον. So we're not talking about the spaces themselves, we're talking about the περιβάλλον, the environment either around them or the environment in them. So again, we're talking about space, but not really talking about space at all. So we think that we're talking about a real place in the first stanza, in the first couplet, and then we actually kind of go into this imagined or created space. In the Greek it's σε δημιούργησα, so I crafted you, or I created you, I imagined you. So this shift from the literal in the first couplet to the metaphorical, or the imaginative plane in the second, is enacted in the lines, in lines 3 and 4. Again, we're confused. The reader is confused because the present tense of the start has now been replaced by the past tense. So I walk, I see, and now it's I crafted you in the past, and so much that happened. So this shift creates this kind of confusion in the text. We also have the problem of vocabulary again. Χαράν, λύπες, περιστατικά πράγματα. I mean, what are these things? What is the joy? What is the sorrow? What are these things that have happened? What exactly is the speaker hinting at? These words are general and they seem to have no anchorage in kind of reality. But instead of resolving this gap between the real and the imaginary, the specific and the vague, the last line of the poem creates another set of issues. We're kind of wondering here, how is it possible that an environment can be given feeling or sensation? And you've been wholly, he's talking to the environment, you've been wholly remade into feeling. Well, the question is, by whom, how? How can an environment be given feeling? Who's giving the feeling? Is it the speaker? Is it the narrator? Again, there's a separate confusion here about the last line. So in a way, we start with what we think is something relatively straightforward, and then we end up in this kind of wall of mirrors, as it were. So why don't we throw this text aside? Why do we take it back? Why do we read it? Why do we reread it? Why don't we just ignore it and say, oh, it's vague, we don't know what's happening? Well, I would suggest that the issue here is the reason why we come back to it is because of the position of the narrator in relation to the events. We sense that the speaker, about whom we know nothing, pretty much, knows exactly what he's describing but doesn't want to tell us. So there's a gap opened up between what is known and what is expressed in the poem. The text acts like a sort of summation of thoughts, where we feel that the narrator knows what he's referring to, like I said, but he doesn't want to tell us for whatever reason. We act as voyeurs to a certain extent because we're given a glimpse of these thoughts, these fragments of thoughts. We're drawn into the text and into the mind of the speaker, and we're forced to try and bridge this gap between the truth of the matter at hand and the poem, which doesn't seem to be exactly about the matter at hand. It seems to kind of swerve around it. Finally, the last line is pretty interesting. Kavafi plays with us in the last line when he tells us that the environment described is just for himself. You've been wholly remade into feeling for me. So then the question is, why the hell are we even reading the text if it's just for him? It's a selfish act. Even though Kavafi's inviting us to read and interpret the poem, to try and understand it, to try and fill in these gaps, he's also hinting to us that the act of creation of both the environment and the poem is a selfish one, one which we will never be able to penetrate. So there's this constant kind of game carried out here. So we're allowed into the gaps of this kind of speech of this text, whilst at the same time told that we're never going to be able to understand them or to be included in them, as it were. The final poem is called The Mirror in the Entrance, 1930. This was written just immediately after Στον ίδιο χώρο. In the entrance hallway of that sumptuous house, there was an enormous mirror, very old, acquired at least 80 years ago. A strikingly beautiful boy, a tailor's assistant, on Sunday afternoons, an amateur athlete, was standing with a package. He handed it to one of the household, who then went back inside to fetch a receipt. The tailor's assistant remained alone and waited. He drew near the mirror and stood gazing at himself and straightening his tie. 5 minutes later, they brought him the receipt. He took it and left. But the ancient mirror, which had seen and seen again throughout its lifetime of so many years, thousands of objects and faces, but the ancient mirror now became elated, inflated with pride, because it had received upon itself perfect beauty for a few minutes. The narrative is quite straightforward. So in the first stanza, we're told that there's a mirror at the entrance of a house. In the second, we witness a boy come to the house to deliver a package and then leave. And in the final stanza, we're seeing a mirror which has now been personified. It's just a very mundane, prosaic act. In the first stanza, the issue that kind of problematizes us, or that creates a problem for us, is one of textual comprehension related to the house and the mirror. We're told that the house is πλούσιο σπίτι, που είχε ένα καθρέφτη εκεί στην είσοδο μέγιστο. What makes the house πλούσιο? We're never told. What makes the καθρέφτη? How μέγιστο is the mirror? In other words, how enormous is the mirror? What are its dimensions? We're kind of drawn into the text by these words, again, these adjectives, πλούσιο, μέγιστο, which the reader has to imagine and kind of fill in. The second stanza also creates some uncertainty, as we are introduced to what seems a boy, so it's called εμορφότατο παιδί, ένα εμορφότατο παιδί, which we would assume would be a boy of 10, 11, 12 years old, but in fact is a youth or a young gentleman, so he could be anything up to, let's say, 18, 19, maybe even 20 years old. This young male is not given a definite age or a physical description, and we're only told that he's wearing a tie. So we have to then assume that he's wearing a shirt, we have to assume the kind of trousers he's wearing, we have to assume that he's wearing a suit, we have to think about what else pictures, how else to imagine the scene, because Kavafi doesn't tell us. We're only told that he has a package and that he's wearing a tie. He obviously has other clothes going on, but we have to imagine it as readers. We're not told what to imagine and how to imagine it. The palette in which to paint the youth is to be decided by us, in combination with the single adjective εμορφότατο. There's an American critic who's noted that no other poet has written so many love poems about beautiful young men, about whom he has little more to say than they are beautiful and young. So again, he's using these adjectives which don't really mean anything in themselves, and we have to kind of fill in the gaps and fill in the blanks to understand what on earth is kind of, what are we looking at, what are we reading. Furthermore, what is the parcel? We know that he works for a tailor, but we don't know what's in the parcel. We don't even know who he's given it to. All that we know is that the transaction has been successful because he receives a receipt, and that the youth has checked his tie in the mirror. That's it. That's all we really find out in the poem. In the final stanza, we move to the mirror. The mirror has a long memory. Παλιός καθρέφτης που έχει δει και δει. The mirror is extremely pleased, so again, we're in this realm of personification, that it could witness the beauty of this individual, even if it was for a few minutes. The irony and the kind of, again, the humor in the situation is that we have no idea what the mirror has seen, and we don't even know what we're looking at. So we're dealing with a mirror which reflects, but we can't see the reflection. The mirror carries out this reflection, and like I said, we don't know what's been seen. The narrator, therefore, turns out again to be the most important figure. He's seen the youth, he knows what he looks like, but he doesn't want to tell us. By highlighting the specific details of the event described, the parcel, the tie, and telling us that the individual is an amateur athlete and tailor's assistant, we are made aware again that the narrator, or the poet, of course, knows more than what he's saying. This gap in information between what is told and what is not told, brings us in as readers to fill in the blanks. Again, the rereadability of Kavafi. Just two very quick points before I reach the conclusion. The first poem, so bringing these three poems a bit more together now, Kavafi's texts are connected to one another when we make the effort to see the connections that exist. So, for example, these three here, like many of his poems, all these texts are related to the individual, the interaction of the individual in geographical locations. They feature characters who lack physical description. They play on ideas of present and past time. Narrative voice, we have a very similar kind of style of narrator in all of them, who both discloses and refuses to disclose information. Again, these are kind of these little gaps again that are appearing in the texts. A small kind of word of caution here. Some readers could potentially say, oh, it's Kavafi that's seeing all of this, but we don't actually have any There's no proof from the text themselves, whether it is Kavafi or this poetic persona or a mask. So there's that connection, the kind of the thematic connections, and there's also linguistic, lexical connections. So in I think the last two poems, we had the word pragmata, things. So we have repeated lexicon. On a wider level, we can also link the poems to other poems in his work. So the Antony poem, το 31 π.Χ. στην Αλεξάνδρεια, links into the other Mark Antony poems, for example, Gessarion, ο Θεός απολύμπεν Αντώνιος, etc., etc. So we can start building up these connections to other texts when we start kind of looking more carefully. And these have been created, these connections by Kavafi. We just have to, in a way, invest the time and effort, the rereading, to find these echoes and repetitions and these links. The second point is one of tone. The three poems are at times tragic, melancholic, humorous, all of these things sometimes at the same time as well. So in the first poem, we see this kind of mad revelry. We see a dusty, clueless man kind of shouting words like oil and aroma for one's hair. This is kind of tragic to a certain degree as well, because the man is lost. But it's also kind of pretty ridiculous. We have someone who's trying to sell hair products in a scene of revelry in a city which kind of doesn't even know that he exists, really. In the second poem, we have a reflective tone, but we can also sense an element of selfishness, like we said, and petulance. Για μένα, σε δημιούργησα για μένα. In the third text, the humour can be detected in two instances. Firstly, in the fact that the youth has come to the house looking messy. He does his tie-up, he sorts his tie out in the mirror because he's obviously come there messy. So he's a way, he's a bad delivery man. And the second kind of bit of humour that we can maybe detect here is that he has to wait 5 minutes. 5 minutes later, they brought him the receipt. It just seems, again, slightly incongruous. Why 5 minutes? What took them so long? Why were they keeping him waiting? So the Kavafian text, therefore, I would suggest, is not one which is uniform in tone, which is kind of flat, but one where we hear these different kind of modulations at the same time, ranging from the tragic to the comic. To conclude, I just wanted to reiterate my main argument and state the reasons why I believe Kavafi is such a rereadable poet. So as I've already said, there are several gaps in our knowledge of Kavafi's life and works. In terms of his biography, we will never find out about his various lovers or incidents that were undocumented during his time in England and Constantinople, and indeed many instances in Alexandria as well. In terms of his poetic texts, there are many places where the involvement of the reader is required in order to try and understand and put together meaning and description, as we saw in our analysis of the three poems. It's these gaps in biography and, most importantly, in the texts, that have allowed literary critics and the general reader, I would suggest, of all ages and of all places, to kind of put their own interpretations into the text, as we saw in our brief overview of the debates, the critical debates, and Twitter and Instagram. Just two very small further points here. Firstly, if I had chosen three different poems, there would be a slightly different set of indeterminacies and sets of gaps that would arise and would have been analysed. So this emphasises, I think, that when we change the combination of texts chosen, we get a different version of the poet and a different version of the Kavafian text. Secondly, the idea of gaps that I've proposed for trying to understand a continued interest in his life, the debates, and the reading of these texts is not meant to be a definitive framework. So I'm not saying that this has solved all the issues in Kavafi scholarship, and it's ridiculous to say that anyway. But it's just an approach that I found quite useful in trying to kind of put everything together. I'm using it as an umbrella term through which to understand his appeal to all types of readers, whether they be young, old, male, female, and Greek-speaking or non-Greek-speaking. And just the final thing I wanted to end with was this quotation, which I think kind of neatly sums up some of the points that I've tried to raise as to why we come back to the poet and why we come back to his poetry. It's by the English poet Stephen Spender, and his explanation is quite simple, but I think it kind of echoes some of the points that I've raised. So this is Spender here in, I think it was the 70s when he said this, but I'm not sure. So the reason why this poetry, in other words, Kavafi's poetry, even in translation seizes our imagination, so much so that those who love it regard it as almost regard it almost as they would a secret addiction, is that it reaches that part of our consciousness which goes back and thinks. So, again, what I feel Spender is saying here is that we go back, we think, we reread, and it has this quality, the poetic text, to kind of seize our imaginations and invite us to come back and reread over time. So, thank you.
A big thank you to Pany for his analytical lecture on Cavafy and his poetry. Thank you very much, Pany.